Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Temple Northup. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University. It goes without saying that over the past few decades, and it's really only increased over time, one of the largest issues that's dominated both the news and public discourse more broadly is immigration. It's definitely a hot button issue within the United States. And it's also something that we in San Diego know a lot about, being one of the major border cities in the country. And it's because of this importance of this topic that we as a School of Journalism and Media Studies decided to launch this year's webinar series focused on stories of migration and immigration. And we're not doing this alone. We've partnered with the Pulitzer Center to add their expertise and experts to our conversation. Today's webinar features a discussion that isn't just focused on immigration though, but also on what's been the largest story of 2020, COVID-19. And after a few introductions, we'll hear from journalists Lydia Chavez and Sindya Bhanoo as they discuss their work in the Mission District in San Francisco, documenting stories during the pandemic as it impacts those often living below the poverty line. Throughout today, we encourage you to share your outtakes on social media. You can tag us, and I'll drop all those social media handles in just a minute in the chat. So feel free to engage in the chat. And if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box and we'll share those and hopefully get those answered toward the end so that we can cover as much possible. We're not going to do long time introducing each panelist or all of us, but before we begin, I want to welcome Fareed Mostoufi from the Pulitzer Center to welcome you all as well.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Fareed Mostoufi, and I work at the Pulitzer Center, and we are so excited to partner with San Diego State, Temple, and our incredible grantees today to share this important story with you all. I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about why we're here today, supporting this event. Hopefully you can see on the screen right now a little bit about us. So the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., but our mission is to increase public awareness about underreported global issues. And sometimes when I'm thinking about what underreported means, I think about that moment when I feel like I'm seeing the same story all the time in the news, and I'm thinking about all the things that aren't getting enough attention, wondering why. These are often underreported stories that aren't getting enough attention. And what we want to do to make sure they do is, one, we provide direct support to journalists through grants. Those are journalists who are freelancers working for multiple publications. They may also be news outlets, teams like the team you're about to hear from today. And those grants cover the costs of their reporting to make sure that stories that otherwise aren't getting the attention they deserve are being seen. Once those stories are published, we also have a public outreach team, and that involves working with the community at large, with colleges and universities and K-12 schools to make sure that these stories continue to be seen, and that the journalists who covered these stories are connecting with community members to answer questions not only about these issues, but also questions about how news is reported, to start a dialogue about how we can critically get engaged with these stories and these issues through the news. So these are some of the places that our grantees have published. This is just a few. You might see some outlets you're familiar with, some that maybe you don't check regularly. We work with over 100 different outlets a year to report on these stories. And these are journalists' passion projects that they research really closely. So they come with a lot of different themes. And here are some of the themes on the screen. If you are interested in learning more about the Pulitzer Center, the reporting that we support, or the becoming more involved in the outreach events like the ones we're hosting today, please connect with us. You can start by, first of all, enjoying today's event. And if you enjoy it, these are a few events we have this week. If you're working with students, we have a webinar tomorrow with Natasha El Ford from the GRIO about her reporting on racial identity in Puerto Rico. We have a exciting panel with a California-based grantee, Sarah Shord, talking about solitary confinement. On the right here, you see a partnership, a webinar that we have with ONA about covering American Muslims. Learn more at pulitzercenter.org, and please connect with us because these stories only really reach their greatest level when they are engaged with and talked about and connected with. So that's why we're here today. We're here to engage deeply with the story and have the special opportunity to connect with the journalists who covered it. We have Lydia Chavez and Sindya Bhanoo with us, both reporters for many publications covering many issues, and today they represent Mission Local and will be telling us about their project, How Do We Survive, which examined the underreported impacts of COVID-19 in the Mission District, covering many different angles and in many different ways. Please join me in the chat in giving us some virtual round of applause to welcome our special guests, Sindya and Lydia. We're so glad you're here, and we turn it over to you. Welcome.
Sindya, you're going to share the screen?
Yes, I'm about to share, and we'll get started.
Get started here. Well, thank you, Farid and Musaf. I think we can go right to the second slide. So next, I'm going to just give you an overview. I'm going to give you a quick overview on the Mission District, on Mission Local, because a lot of you are journalists, and this is something that you can do even as students. We're going to do a project overview and sort of look at whether we made a difference. And Sindya's going to talk also about what's next, what she's working on next. So the Mission District, as you can see, it's a little bit off of downtown. It's a flat neighborhood. It's a neighborhood really that has been defined by immigration and migration. And in the late 1970s and 1980s, as the neighborhood that was the least expensive because of the aging of the housing, it became sort of the place where immigrants fleeing the Central American wars ended up. And so we have a lot of Central American immigrants. We continue to have immigrants from Central America and from Mexico. And this has really defined the Mission District. It is an incredibly rich. It became also the center of the Mexican Chicano intellectual artistic community in the late 1970s. A couple of very important institutions were set here. It became sort of, because of also the cheap commercial rents, a place where people experimented with food a lot. And a lot of the major places, food places, started in the Mission District. It has a lot of independent businesses, and unlike a lot of neighborhoods in San Francisco, it has many commercial streets. It probably has 5, 6, 7 commercial streets rather than just one. It is a neighborhood with all of the best of San Francisco and all of the urban problems in housing. Recently, it's been very, changed, I would say, by starting in the late 1990s, the influx of white and Asian tech workers. And it became a popular neighborhood for that, not only because the richness of the culture and the food scene, but it has the quickest sort of route down to Silicon Valley. So you can live here, grab a bus and go straight down instead of having to cross the whole city, which can take 40 minutes. The next slide. Mission Local started in 2008 as a project at Berkeley where I taught, and it was started with students. We've been working steady on it since then. In 2014, it became independent from the school. We thought we'd try and see, I was interested in experimenting with a business model, foolishly, and tried to see if we could make it independent. So now it's run with a staff of 3 full-time staff, myself, and then sort of a revolving group of interns that are all paid interns. We've always just had paid interns. Our readership skews younger, 25 to 45, 58%. It skews a little bit male, as the neighborhood does as well. We've grown a lot. We started out, I think, even below 24,000. We're now at about 300,000 uniques a month. We shot up to over 500,000 in the first couple of months of COVID, but we sort of settled down. Our funding comes from a lot of support within the neighborhood, 65% from donors, and 20%, I would say, of that are from larger donors. 30% is from foundations, and the foundation money is small, and it's very new. I mean, I would say this year we've gotten a lot of $5,000 and $10,000 grants. And recently just got another grant from the wonderful Pulitzer Center, 22,000. So next slide. It's, you know, I knew immediately that this would be a huge story for us and it would sort of consume us. I was sort of really just editing Mission Local and assigning stories. And with this, I knew that I would have to be working and out reporting again, which I hadn't done for a long time. So we knew immediately that this neighborhood would be not ground zero, but very important in terms of resources because of the immigrant population, because it was a population that has no safety net. And we knew that would be huge. I mean, all of a sudden stores are closing, people's source of income is just vanishes, and people have no savings. So we knew it would be big, and we knew it would be sort of a crazy story. One of the first stories we did was the mayor, on the day that she announced that we were sheltering in place, she, you know, calmed people and said, don't panic. And as soon as she said that, I looked across and I saw Julian and I said, let's go. You take one side of the neighborhood, I'll take the other, the grocery stores, there's going to be panic. And sure enough, there was. So this big, you know, panic and this sense of just doom among the immigrants that we were talking to. People were really scared, and I think to some extent still are. So next slide. My routine in those early mornings were to get up in the morning, apply to every grant I could possibly think of, and be out the door by 9 a.m. to report. And in the midst of this, and this might be interesting for students and for, you know, you're forming relationships, you're at your school, and these relationships you form can be enduring in really important ways. In the midst of this, I get an email from Sindya, who is sitting in Austin, Texas, and really, in a way, it wouldn't have mattered where she was sitting. I paid attention. And, you know, she's thinking about the importance of documenting the lives of undocumented families. Of course, I am too. It's right in front of me. But I know that when Sindya is suggesting something, that she is going to bring a lot to the table, that she thinks outside of the box, that it's going to be creative, that she's going to be hugely involved even though she's in Austin, and that it's just going to be a win. So I really did think about this. Yes, of course, let's do this. So now Sindya can tell us what she was thinking back in Austin. That I was just crazy enough to take you up on this. I can't hear you. Sindya, you have to unmute.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Before I talk about what I was thinking for this project, I just wanted to go back in time to 2007. Lydia didn't mention, but I was her student at Berkeley, at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. And so I've known her for 14 years, and I worked on my master's thesis with her, which was on undocumented students at UC Berkeley. And it was about the organizing they were doing with other students in California and with the national network of undocumented students. They were lobbying for the DREAM Act. They were lobbying to become United States citizens. And I spent a lot of time with them that year. I kind of followed them around campus. I went to their meetings. I went with them to Washington, D.C., where they met with legislators. In these pictures here, you see some of the students. This is in San Francisco. They were fasting for a day to draw attention to their cause. But during that time, I just got to hear their stories of their lives as students. Some of them arrived with just a sleeping bag to campus and no place to stay, no dorm room, no apartment. They didn't have money for food. They didn't have money for textbooks. They had to borrow and share. And I was just a few years out of undergrad myself. And I just sort of saw how my experience was so different from theirs. And when I started reporting on the pandemic, I was reporting for the Washington Post starting in March, starting on Super Tuesday. And I quickly saw what a difference it makes, the resources that you have, how it really affects the way that you experience this pandemic. So that's what was on my mind when I went to Lydia. Just trying to So we started talking about this project, and what I envisioned and my goal was to tell a story that looked beyond the numbers. And the reporting I was seeing coming out of national outlets, they were one-off stories about job loss, about nannies losing their job, or about housekeepers losing their job. But I wanted to look beyond that, tell the stories of individuals and follow those individuals over time. This pandemic is ongoing and we're still very much in the middle of it. So I didn't want to sort of drop off with an individual. And I wanted to do that to build a kind of archive of these stories, so that we capture them now and we have them now, but also so that later we have this to come back to, and that the community that we're reporting on also has it to come back to. So that's what I was thinking. And I also knew from the beginning that I wanted to utilize illustrations for this project. And that was for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk about, but I wanted to use illustrations, and I had seen some experimentation with using graphic short stories to report nonfiction. And so I wanted to experiment with that as well. And the reasons for illustrations, one was simple. It was a way to protect identities. And some of the people that we're working with and interviewing are undocumented. This is a way to protect them. Also, during a year when we can't do the kind of up close long-term reporting, spending hours with a person the way that we usually do as reporters, I thought that illustrations could address some of that, because we have to be socially distanced and we can't be up close. So what we did in some cases was get pictures from the people we were interviewing, and then we could give that to the illustrator, and the illustrator could use that. And in some cases, you could also take 4 or 5 photographs and combine them to create one powerful illustration. And the last thing is, there is something about these illustrations where the faces, it's simpler than a photograph. And those simpler lines, I think it draws people in. It builds a sense of empathy. And I think it holds the reader's attention in a way maybe that photographs don't always succeed in doing. And this is something I'm still thinking about and experimenting with and trying to understand. But that's what I was thinking. So once we had sort of that basic idea, we then built this framework, and we tried to figure out, who are the characters that we want to follow for this project. And Lydia had a lot of contacts. I mean, she's in the mission, reporting in the mission, and had been following this from the very beginning. So we assembled people who would sort of tell the story of the Mission District and what's happening there. We had Hugo, who owns a small electronics repair business, and many of his customers were bringing in damaged cell phones or tablets that need to be fixed. Many of those customers were undocumented, so we thought that he would offer us a view into his customer base. We had a husband and wife couple, Connie and Ricardo, and they were immigrants from Mexico with 2 kids, and they were doing pretty well in building 2 small businesses until the pandemic hit. We had a young woman named Kimberly who was in college at San Francisco State. Her mother and uncle are immigrants from El Salvador. They live in a small 1-bedroom in the Mission District. So telling that story, she was on the brink of kind of entering the world as an adult when this happened. We had a young mother of 3 who was an essential worker, and she got COVID, telling the story of that family and how do you handle this when you have very little as far as resources. And then we also had a few topics. These aren't characters exactly, but Lydia pointed out early on that everywhere she was seeing lines, those lines at the grocery store, at the food bank, lines of people, going to get tested. And so we began to collect stories from the lines about people that we met along the way. And then we also we devoted a whole section to money. And when I was in graduate school, I remember Lydia always saying to follow the money. And so this was about these were the stories about where the money was going. I mean, where is the aid money going? Where are the donations going? How do you get that money? Is there enough of it? Is it going to the right places? And so that was sort of a whole series following the money that we envisioned. And because this is an unfolding story, we launched our site as soon as we could with the characters that we had identified without yet putting up our stories, which were released in an ongoing way. So we kind of put it up in this form with the illustrations and sort of a preview of who these people were, what these topics were, just to give readers kind of a sense for what was coming. And so I think now what we'll do is we'll tell you a little bit more about the stories that we did. I'm going to hand it back to Lydia, and she'll talk about Connie and Ricardo.
Sure. Sindya said they own a business. They actually owned two businesses, stores that sell, jewelry and masks and different little items from Mexico. And they're both wonderful people. I visited them, their store on the first day of shelter in place. And Connie was there. She was supposed to be closed. And the door was half open. And I go in to talk to Connie. And I'm talking to her about what is going to happen, and she breaks down. I mean, she's just beside herself. And I said, there is shelter in place, Connie. The door is supposed to be. And she said, I just can't do it. It's just because when she shuts that door, that means there's no income. And she is saying, there's no sales, we don't eat. And it just really became clear to me that checking in with her would be really important. So I started to do that on a regular basis. And I asked her along the lines if she would mind if I wrote about sort of their journey. And she didn't at all. And so I, started recording it. And I can't remember when we published the first piece. We're now due for a second installment. At the end of the first installment, they had to decide whether or not to close their second store, which they had just opened 2 years ago. And they had put a tremendous amount of work into the store. They had taken over a space that was really dilapidated and completely fixed it up. And it was just clear that the pandemic was going to last and they were going to have to shut it. It was a very, very tough decision. And that segment ends with their closing of the store. And the next segment will be published fairly soon. But, again, just following them over time, I don't know what will happen a year from now. I know that they're beginning a very important season in terms of Day of the Dead and Christmas, and sales were very important in this, and we'll see how they do. The next slide. Another story that just came out from, everyone here that works here, a lot of just walking around and reporting. And something that became really clear early on is that this group that I never heard of, Latino Task Force, I kept running into them on the street, handing out food, doing outreach. I felt like, who are these people? And I know the warning in journalism is never write about an organization because it tends to be boring. But I really felt like their work needed to be recorded. And I was just curious as to who they were and how they came together. And so that ended up being really a magazine or piece that I wrote with another wonderful illustration from Molly. An incredibly interesting group that has really pushed things here in the Mission District and given attention to the lack of resources. The other thing I wanted to, the next slide, just point out for anyone running a small site, the next slide, Sindya, is that, you have, no, the one before. The one before, yeah, oops, keeps, one more back. The one with recursos on it, and yeah. You have we knew immediately that there was a lack of, the monolingual Spanish speakers didn't know what was going on. We knew we could start translating our articles immediately, which we did, but it would take time to build that. And we began to see that people just needed information on where to get this, how to this when the food bank was running. So we had been on the lines, as Sindya said, and we had been collecting phone numbers, and we started a texting service that has grown and become pretty popular. And on the texting service, it's just in Spanish, and we send out, just when we get an alert that something is going to happen or you can get resources here, we send that out by Spanish and trying to give people a little bit of a leg up. And then the other thing we did, which we wouldn't normally do, UCSF was doing a big testing study in the Mission District, and there had not been much testing in San Francisco because of the difficulty that everyone was having with testing. But they knew that they could see by who was going to the hospital that there was a disparate impact on Latino population. So they wanted to do a testing study in the highest density Latino census tract. And people that we were talking to in that census tract, monolingual Spanish speakers, had real issues about going for a test when they'd been told to shelter in place. So we put together a Q&A in Spanish and English. We published it on our site. We sent a link through our text service, but we also did something we wouldn't normally do, which is we made 1,000 copies and delivered them door to door. The reporters, I, and some other people helped us. But it's just the responsibility you have as a small site in a pandemic in getting information out. And the next slide. This, all of these stories, the lines, the characters, we began to follow UCSF and the doctors and got to know the doctors pretty well because they were living in the Mission District. And we could really begin to see that this was a tale of two cities in terms of how the city was using its resources. And you can see the bottom half of the map is where all of the COVID cases are. And the rest of the city is really, the positivity rates are probably 1% in most of the other neighborhoods. And they could be as high as 11, 15% in some of the census tracts in the southeastern part of the neighborhood. So we started looking at, and again, I just want to mention this because it's what a small site can do if you're thinking. We started looking at the data. We started, because of our sources within the medical community, they started giving us, the city would not give us data on who was being tested. They would just give us the case numbers. So people started feeding us information. We started talking to them, and we put enough together. I had been hearing for week after week, the public health officials here say, we follow the science and the data, we follow the science and the data. And in fact, they were not following the science and data to test in the most impacted communities. In fact, Latinos took up 51% of the cases at that point. It's now 50% of COVID cases, and they had 9% of the tests. So this was a big story, and we published it, and the local district supervisors called for hearings. And then in the meantime, we took that data and we had people outside of San Francisco at Johns Hopkins, at Duke, look at it, and did another story about experts are baffled why the Latino community is getting so few resources. And a week after that story, the city gave $28 million to the Latino community. So, even a small site can have a big impact, and I think it's important for students to know that. One of the stories that Sindya mentioned earlier, and I'm going to hand it over to her, was the story of Kimberly, someone I have known for a long time. And I asked her at the beginning of this to begin a journal, and I gave her some prompt questions. And then 3 months into the pandemic, I looked at this journal. It was ginormous. And I just thought, oh, wow, this is a great task for Sindya. She'll do something brilliant with this. So I handed it over to Sindya. Go ahead, we've done this. Sindya, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I just unmuted myself. So we had that young woman, Kimberly, who was a college student at the time at San Francisco State. And she had that journal that Lydia mentioned, which sort of just, it was her day-to-day life, what she was doing and what she was experiencing. And I felt that there was something there, but there was also no news peg for her particular story. And I thought that there was still sort of emotional weight there, which is important, I thought, for people to see what it was like to be this young Latina woman in the Mission District about to graduate. Her mother and uncle, who she lives with in a one-bedroom, are not wealthy. She had lost her job. Kimberly was a student, but also worked at the restaurant in Nordstrom's in San Francisco. So I thought sort of crystallizing this into a visual experience and sort of telling her story still in the form of a diary, a story of her daily life using pictures. As you can see, we used real photographs of Kimberly's apartment and apartment building, and we had our illustrator draw illustrations of Kimberly's mother and uncle and Kimberly and other people that she was interacting with. And this kind of successfully told the story of her isolation in San Francisco's Mission District and conveyed what she was feeling. And we were able to reprint this story, and it was really well received. So what we did was we told her to continue keeping a diary, and we did a part 2 to her story. And by then, and this also tells the story of what's happening in the city and what other people are experiencing. So the city starts opening up again. Kimberly gets her job back at Nordstrom's. She's really scared, but for the first time, she's around young people in the lunchroom when she's working. But all of that shuts down so quickly within a couple weeks. She's out of a job again. Nordstrom's is closed. She's worried about being exposed, and she has to go get tested. So you kind of see like the ongoing stress that this young woman is under. And I hope through the illustrations and this graphic short story form, we feel kind of drawn in, and it's a little bit more of an immersive experience. We also, so we used many different forms. Lydia talked about sort of magazine style reporting, shorter stories, the illustrated stories. We also did some video. This video, which I'll show, is about Hugo. And Hugo, if you remember, owned the electronics repair shop, the small shop, and he is documented. So we were able to get him on camera. And so I'll just share, it's under 2 minutes. I'll just share that video. Let me know, please, if you can't hear.
We have a customer, he doesn't believe in what's going on. He saw me wearing my mask and he was like, Hugo, don't fall into this. Nobody should be telling us what to do or what not to do. This is just all false. Personally, I started taking it seriously when my uncle got sick, just because it went from something that you just hear in the news to it happening to somebody so close. So that's when it really hit us. Sure. My uncle, my dad's brother, works for him, and he fell ill. So he's not even awake. They just do phone calls, and they put the phone to his ears, and then we have like Zoom meetings where everybody prays. The doctors told us that he would not make it, that we could wait for a miracle, but in other words, to start thinking about funeral costs and all that stuff. Day by day, he's been getting a little bit better. Ever since my uncle got sick, I just moved into the store completely. I brought clothing, and I bought a futon for my sister-in-law. Just that and a little table where I go have lunch. And I have a stuffed animal that my daughter gave me. She says that I always call her a monkey, so she wanted me to have that. And a little mouse that my son made for me. He built this mouse out of a toilet paper, the cardboard of the toilet paper. He made the body and the head and everything. It's hard for everybody.
Here, I just wanted to, oh, did we lose the screen share?
No, it's there.
Okay, for some reason I can't see it. Okay. So I just wanted to quickly point out that there were illustrations in the video as well, and those illustrations allowed us to show things that we couldn't capture on video. Hugo's room in the back of his store where he was sleeping because he wanted to isolate himself from his family. The Zoom prayer meeting. So again, there was sort of a use for those for the illustrations. I wanted to just very briefly now talk about what we're doing next. The Pulitzer Center has very kindly renewed its support for our work. And our project now is focused on schools. It's called Report Card, and it's looking at the hurdles that Latinx students in the mission are facing during this pandemic school year. And we're following students and teachers and families for the duration of the year. These are families where parents are essential workers and kids might be at home alone. Families where older students, in some cases, students who are just in middle school are babysitting and taking care of their younger siblings while also trying to do their schoolwork. Families that are facing economic hardship and job loss. And in the case of undocumented families, they do not qualify for unemployment. Healthcare, access to good healthcare is an issue. We know also that high-speed internet access is an issue. And even when they do have hotspots provided, sometimes it's not fast enough. It's not enough to support multiple children in that house who are all on Zoom. In some cases, there are homeless families that teachers have to find a way to work with. So there are all of these issues. The Mission District and the Outer Mission continue to have the highest number of confirmed cases in the city. So that's the project, and we're continuing to use illustrations and experiment with the power of those illustrations. And the 3-part series on students will be illustrated, and we're also recording Zoom calls, and we're using the audio, and we're combining illustrations and audio to tell these stories of students and their families this year. And again, that's because we can't because of the pandemic. I talked about the story I did years ago following those undocumented students at UC Berkeley. I followed them so closely for the whole year. And in this case, it's very difficult to do something like that. But Zoom allows us to get a little closer. And I'm hoping the illustrations allow us to tell these stories in an intimate way. Along with that, as a kind of sidebar, we're working with a high school that's adjacent to the Mission District, where a lot of mission kids go, to tell graphic short stories in memoir form, written and illustrated by students. And that'll be kind of in a serial form, and we're working with 4 art students there. So that's where we're at, and we're happy to take questions. And I'll hand it back over to Temple and Fareed.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. And we've got some questions. And the first one that I'll ask, because it was something that I was, in fact, curious about myself, was about the process of the illustrations, and specifically, how did you find and then work with the artists and the illustrators to create such engaging illustrations?
Well, do you want me to take some of that? We had worked with both of these illustrators in the past. Molly has done, she's illustrated a whole bar series that we have, and I know she's very talented, and she's also a trained journalist. She has an MFA in art, and she's a trained journalist. So her process is really methodical, the way she goes about doing this. First reading the story, picking out the details that she might want to include in an illustration, and then biking out to the site, taking photographs, getting a sense of the area if she can, and then sitting down to think about composition. And Sindya worked with Lola on the Kimberly story, so you might want to talk about how you worked with Lola.
Yeah, so for the Kimberly story, what we did was, and we kind of modified this, we did we did a follow-up. So the first time I went through the diary entries and my interviews, and I had a transcript which I gave to Lola, and she worked from that. And we had pictures that Kimberly sent us, and in some cases we asked her to take for us. And Lola kind of worked through it, and she would send me panels, and then I would respond if I thought something wasn't accurate. What was tricky was actually adding in the text. So she did all the text by hand, and she put it in. But in some cases, the text needed to be modified. So the second time around, I gave her tentative text. I had her do the illustrations. We went back and forth, and then I went over the text, and then we kind of put in the final text. But it was a process, and it's a learning process too. And I think illustrations take time. Photographs are free, and you can take many of them. But yeah, it's a learning process for us.
Thank you. Another question comes from Mark. He was curious, how meticulously did you try to keep secret the identities of people you focused reporting on? Beyond changing their names, was there more that you did?
I would say that, Molly talked a little bit about this in she did a lot of the illustrations for the, the profiles and the lines. And she was, for instance, there's an illustration of a woman in front of two children in a stairwell. And she had an idea of what the woman looked like, but it's not exact. I mean, she was able to actually you would have a very difficult time, and she did not use her stairwell or her building in that case. So yeah, we were pretty careful. I mean, we're as careful as, yes, it's an important aspect of this.
In one case, I think we used a middle name also instead of a first name to protect the identity.
Thank you. Another question comes from Lourdes, who's one of our journalism faculty members here at SDSU. And she had a question for you specifically, Sindya, although I think both of you can answer this. And how do you develop the rapport needed to get access to undocumented families' homes? And what do you do to make sure you protect their identity? Well, some of that we just answered, but yeah, so how do you go about getting that access?
It's difficult. I'm not a Spanish speaker, which, and in many cases, these families speak only Spanish. So it's not easy, it takes time. Back when I was doing it as a graduate student, I had sort of a contact outside of that group who introduced me. And again, here we're working with nonprofits that the families feel, safe talking to, and because we're being introduced through them, that helps. We also have a translator who translates her work. She's also helping me, and I think that adds another level of comfort. And Lydia, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I've never found it that difficult with adults. I find you have to be very, in fact, sort of protective. They'll give you, I've never had any difficulty getting full names, age, phone numbers of undocumented people, but then the responsibility is on the journalist. I think that they're much more protective and careful about their children. And many of their children are actually US citizens, which is interesting. And that takes a lot of time and trust, and then also buy-in from the student. I think the younger students are going to be much more difficult. The parents even may want them. Like, I met a woman, and I talked about the project, the education project, and she was very interested, and her daughter was nearby, and I talked to her a little bit, and she said these projects are really, really important to take part in. But then with the little girl at home, she just wasn't interested. So, you can get the trust of the parent, but then the child may not be interested. It's tricky. It's time.
Yeah, I'll add also to what Lydia is saying, that there are people who are really excited to share their story and people who are a little more, who hesitate a little bit, but they all want to. I think they know how important it is for the story to be told. yeah, I mean, I think they sort of, they want their voices to be heard. So, so right now there are 2 undocumented families that I'm talking to whose children are in the San Francisco schools, and one has been very forthcoming. The other one is hesitating, but wants to. I mean, she keeps calling back. So, and then I understand her concerns.
And while you were doing this reporting, given that we're in a pandemic, Susanna asks, how did you safeguard your own health?
Yeah, we were actually out reporting a lot. We wore masks from the very beginning, even before it wasn't a thing. And we also, I don't allow any of the reporters to go in any enclosed place to do any reporting at all. It's all out on the street, in front of someone's house. A woman wanted a reporter to go and go all the way to El Cerrito. And I said, well, what are you going to do when you get there? You can't report in her house. And so they arranged that they would be in her garden. So just doing everything outdoors and keeping a safe distance has been, yeah, sort of our policy here.
I think also we've learned how to be really efficient, or I've learned how to be really efficient and do as much pre-reporting ahead of time as possible on the phone. And the story, I'm doing that now for the reporting I'm doing for Mission Local and for the Texas Monthly, also funded by the Pulitzer Center. But for a story I did for the Washington Post recently, I mean, it was weeks of pre-reporting on the phone. And when I went on site, it was at a hospital. I entered the hospital, I was masked, but I didn't do, it was to get the scene and to see what it was like. It was about a hospital worker. And I didn't actually ask questions there. I did that all before and after.
Great. And Keith was wondering, during the time of the pandemic, has there been increased activity by ICE looking to arrest or to deport people? And has that been, that aspect been a component of your work?
Well, there have been rumors in the mission. There was just last week, and we check out every one, but nothing so far that we can see. I mean, people are definitely concerned about that. But not here. San Diego might be more of a place where that would happen.
Okay. And another question about the illustrations was, did it slow down your process very much to work with illustrators?
I think for the one illustration per story, I think Molly worked incredibly fast. I gave her the 4,000 word magazine piece the night before I needed the illustration the next day, and she was quick. But on a longer illustrated story, I do think it's much more time consuming. And I just gave her a story that she illustrated on Casa Guadalupe, and it took a couple of weeks. What was your experience, Sindya, with Lola?
Yeah, I think it definitely takes more time. I think it takes more time, and I think that's okay. Not all reporting has to be turned around, in a day or two, and sometimes it does. But I think that one of my goals here was to build that archive that we will have to go back to in the years to come. I mean, decades from now, I hope it's something that we can come back to, so we know what the experience was of this community in the mission. And so that it's fine, I think, to take a little bit of extra time, but it absolutely, that the photograph is instant, and the illustration can take at least a few days.
We had a couple of questions about the Pulitzer funding. And so just sort of putting together the timeline a bit. From Sindya's email with this idea to when did you actually apply for the funding and get it? And at what point in the planning process did you feel you had enough research and data to put in that application?
Sindya, do you want to talk about that?
I don't remember the date of that email, but I want to say, I mean, I started reporting on the pandemic in March and started thinking about this, and I must have sent the email to Lydia maybe in late April is my guess. And then we started working on the Pulitzer application in May, and the Pulitzer application was kind of in two parts. I mean, we submitted an initial application and they came back to us for specifics. So we worked on initial stories. And then as soon as the funding came through, we tried to work quickly to put up that initial site. So that was by June 16th. Yeah, so from start, I would say that first email to Lydia was in late April, and then we launched our site on June 16th. And we had to kind of quickly assemble a team and talk to the videographer and the illustrators, and our web, we hired someone to do the web design also.
It was actually late March 27th. Yeah.
Great. Mark wondered if any of this work has appeared in Spanish language media.
We translate everything. Everything has been translated. And, we offered it to the local, but it's also a bilingual publication. And we've now talked to a radio station about sharing some of it. I don't know exactly how we're going to be sharing it, but we're totally open. I mean, anyone really is welcome to the material.
Yeah, so that the Pulitzer funding also supported that. I mean, translation is expensive and it allowed for that. And we translated even Kimberly's story, that graphic short story, and we'll continue to do that with this report card project. And that is really important so that, we want many people to read this work, and we want the people that we're reporting on to also have access to it and to know that their stories are being told.
Well, I think we have time. I'll ask a question that I'm always curious as the head of a school of journalism. What do you think makes, your reporting successful? Like, what things either that you learned or in school or have learned through your career makes, this is an incredibly wonderful piece that you all did. What are components that lead to the success of a story?
One thing for myself that I found, just be open to new ideas, new possibilities. That someone from the outside can bring someone intelligent can bring a lot of value. And then adding value, of course, we have other media outlets here. There's no sense in repeating what they're doing. What can we do that's different? What can we add to this story? So I think those two things for myself.
Lydia was my teacher, and my career started with her. But so I will pass on the advice that she gave us. But she told us that she could teach us to write, but she could never teach us to be curious, she said. And, that's something that has to come from within you. I think the stories that you pursue should be ones that you really care about, that you want to get to the bottom of. She also told us to trust our eyes. I mean, observe the world and write about the world that you see. And so I have learned to do that. I sort of hesitated to incorporate my own voice early on in my reporting, but over the years, I've kind of come to trust myself as a reporter. And I think that's important.
Wow, that's a really great observation. And I think that could be a really great point to end on, trusting yourself as a reporter. I want to thank you all so much for participating in this event today. Everyone who is watching us live or watching us later on our YouTube channel, thank you so much. We're a school based in continual improvement. So we want to know what everyone thought about this webinar. So you're going to get a survey about the webinar. Please fill it out. We'll also send you a link for this presentation, which you can watch again. And of course, you can share with others. And if you think of other ways that we as a School of Communication, of Journalism and Media Studies can serve the community, then we are all ears. Fareed, did you have any last comments or anything before we sign off?
Thank you all so much. And I really appreciate that some of you are already here, have been participating in the chat a lot, but I'm seeing Jasmine mentioning the last comment about trusting your eyes. Andrea mentioning this was all wonderful. Dr. Sweetser saying, I loved Cynthia's answer to this. Such a wonderful presentation from John Sawyer, our executive director at the Pulitzer Center and founder. As you, before you leave, if you wanted to leave a comment in the chat, that's somewhere I think Sindya and Lydia will be checking to see what stuck with you. And I guess the last thing I wanted to see is Lydia, Sindya, was there anything you wanted to say before we wrap up today?
Oh, I think that's about it for me. How about you, Sindya?
No, I mean, I know that there are journalism students in the audience, and I was once a journalism student, and I think this is important work, and it needs to be done. So I encourage you all to continue doing the work you're doing.
Yes, and we will have another webinar in about a month, which we'll also let you all know about in a follow-up email. So thank you, everyone, for attending again, and thank you, Sindya and Lydia, for your time and that wonderful presentation. And everyone, stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.